In this workshop, our focus is on ways that you can bring your presence into your research writing, which may sound a little bit odd because we think of research writing as very neutral, very objective, but in fact, there are many ways that authors bring themselves into their texts, which is what we'll focus on. I want to share with you an agenda first. So we'll kind of introduce the idea of author presence. And then I'll talk through and do some activities with you in several different areas of author presence. And those are how authors show attitudes toward their research, which we call stance, how authors boost their credibility, how authors acknowledge and interact with their readers or engagement, and how authors sometimes play with academic style. And before we finish, I have a sort of application exercise for us to take a very neutral, objective text and try to work with it a little bit to bring some author presence using these different areas. So the goal of the workshop is for you, I hope, to get some tools, both linguistic and rhetorical, for controlling how readers might perceive you as the author of the text. And I want to kind of introduce that idea. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about my interest in this area. So I've been teaching academic writing for many years, and I've been publishing on it for many years. I was a journal editor, which has really, I think, enhanced my understanding of research writing and publication writing. My research is on second language writing and academic writing, including writing for publication. And I've done some research, several studies, a couple of which I will share some findings with you today, specifically on what we call voice and identity in published writing, and also in student academic writing. I'm going to focus on published writing, obviously, in our workshop today. As we talk through some of the ways that authors bring their presence into their writing, we'll see that that can vary by discipline as well. So I want to start off by thinking through what this means, this idea of author presence. And I have two texts here that I'm just going to read. And as I'm reading them, I want you to think through which of these two do you think has more author presence? And why do you think that? So text A, perhaps the most striking finding from this study is the steady increase in social isolation experienced throughout by both men and women, albeit with generally more disadvantage for boys, men than girls, women. It is a sad commentary that humans who rely on social connection for physical and mental health and even survival begin to experience diminishing levels of connection sorry, I can't see the bottom of my screen. There we go. As early as emerging adulthood. So that's A. Text B. According to a recent study of 14 European countries, nearly 30% of grandparents provided care to both great-grandparents and grandchildren. Those who cared for great-grandparents were, contrary to conventional wisdom, more likely to care for grandchildren compared with those who did not care for great-grandparents. Okay, you can put in the chat which of these two texts you feel has more author presence. We have a lot of A's so far. And thank you for putting some explanation too, because the author came up with their own argument without citing any author, more emotion. Great. I am highlighted areas. Perhaps it gives us this sense of that the author has some feelings, right? They're not just stating a point, they're saying, well, maybe. And that's most striking finding. That's really sort of a detailed, again, it's an attitude about the finding. It's saying it's important, it's surprising. This, albeit with generally more disadvantage, and the sad commentary, all kind of stand out to me as markers of author presence. It's where we get a sense of how the author feels about the research. Yeah, so that's great. And then if you look at the rest of that passage, I thought this was such an interesting text from a sociology journal. You've seen the first few lines, but then it continues. Yet the present study suggests that social contexts associated with partnership status have the potential to alter gendered trajectories of social isolation over time. You can see there's many places here where we get this presence of the author, where they're saying they're maybe hedging, the study suggests, has the potential to alter. And then this really strong, we need a much deeper understanding, where they're claiming an argument and making a pretty strong commitment. As you are reading scholarship in your field, what kinds of images do you form about authors when you read their research texts? It can be anything, but I am guessing that there are certain things that make you think, oh, I think this author is maybe credible. But there's many, many adjectives that you might think of when you read an author's text, any author. Activist versus academic, that's really interesting, right? So some authors might come across as having a sort of activist agenda. And I'm assuming that's not the ones that come across as academic, that sounds maybe in this dichotomy, maybe the academic is more neutral. If they're in their research, maybe arguing for a particular change or stating something that they think is problematic in society, that's maybe more taking more of an activist position. I love the items in the chat. So expert versus novice, fluency, clarity of thought. They're serious, willing to show their personality, persuasive, argumentative, objectivist. I have a colleague who I always thought from his writing before I met him that he was like really mean, maybe, because his writing was very argumentative. And then I met him and he's the nicest person, but in his writing, he appears almost combative. Because of certain things he does in his text. So confidence, methodologist, objectivist, these are great. So you've shown that as you're reading, you're kind of forming images of authors, and sometimes well-read. Sometimes we can think of that as voice, right? So we get a sense of the author's voice from choices that they make in their text. So in addition to the items you read, or some of these are the same, we might see them as reliable, credible, expert, confident, maybe not confident, innovative or unoriginal, engaging, boring, well-read, which you had in the chat, uninformed, maybe interdisciplinary or very disciplinary, knowledgeable or inexperienced. So there's lots of different things that we might imagine about an author. And we get those typically, if we haven't met the person, we get that from the text, from various aspects of the text. I want to share some findings with you from a study I did about more than 10 years ago now with a colleague of mine. And we surveyed editorial board members of 6 different journals. We had 70 respondents in this survey. And these journals were all in social sciences. And we asked them what aspects of author identity they often made guesses about when they were doing manuscript reviews. So that blind peer review, they didn't know the author's name, but they reviewed the paper. And the most common area that they guessed about was the author's experience in the field. So based on the writing, they were making judgments about whether this person was an experienced author and scholar or a newer author and scholar. You can see the other areas and how common they were. So disciplinary background was pretty common. Language background was pretty common. Nationality, and then we kind of get into lower numbers. Institutional affiliation, educational background, and so on. So what we found was that readers do make guesses, and the most common was about experience. 61% of the survey respondents said, yes, when I read a manuscript, I sometimes guess the author's experience. So we don't know if they guessed correctly, but they're making judgments. So the question of whether they're accurate is exactly what we kind of want to think about in this workshop, is how can we control maybe what they're guessing about our experience, our disciplinary background, etc. So also in the same survey, again, 70 respondents, we asked them, well, what are you, if you are making guesses about the author, what are the clues that you're using to construct this author identity? What are the things that are making you decide if they are experienced or where they're from? And the areas that I've highlighted first, these are all related to the sort of content of the paper. So they said that they look at the breadth of knowledge in the paper, the choice of topic, the way the author represents the field, their theoretical framework, how they represent other researchers, how they use jargon, and even their methodology. So those types of choices are influencing how these particular peer reviewers imagine the author. So those are conceptual and content and disciplinary areas. They also identified several aspects of just the writing, just the text. Your choice of sentence structure, writing conventions, whether it was carefully edited or not carefully edited, writing style, was it consistent or inconsistent? The pattern of citations, the pattern in the list of references, the formatting, and particular genre conventions. And when we also interviewed people, and what we found was that when writers conform to the expected conventions in the discipline, they were more likely to be perceived as an experienced writer. And when they were kind of deviating from those in a way that looked like they didn't know the conventions, then often the readers would guess that maybe they're new. And I want to show an example, kind of more specific example of that. So we also carried out, this was just a qualitative study where we took an author's paper that was a real paper that they had submitted to a journal, a manuscript, and it had no name on it, and we gave it to two people who review for that journal, and we asked them to just complete a peer review. So it was a mock peer review, not a real peer review, but they did it exactly as they would do a real peer review, and they were experts in the field. And they wrote a review, and then we interviewed each of the reviewers, and we asked them many things, but we tried to learn what they thought about the author. And it was very, very interesting that we found that they were making kind of judgments about the author very quickly. And a lot of those judgments were grounded in the author's text. So this is an image of the text. You actually don't need to read it. I just want to point out some of the things that the reviewers said. So they talked about how other scholarship was positioned. And they said there's a kind of aggressive positioning of other scholarship. And it seems like a masculine kind of move to me. So this reviewer immediately thought, this is a man. This author is a male. In another area, the fake reviewer said, there's phrases like on page 2, this begs a larger question, or in this regard, or herein lies the disconnect. These phrases just read to me like something that maybe that's just my own experience working with students, the way my male master's degree students are more likely to approximate published scholarship than the women students. I don't know. That's just the way it looks to me. And then another item that they said was, it's not the revising and editing that we would see from an established scholar who's sending a piece to a top tier journal. So they're saying the writing is not great. It's not what I would think of for a top scholar. And then, I wonder about how much the person has read. So just from this text, they're making judgments that this is written by a male, that this is written by a graduate student, that it is not an established scholar, and that the scholar hasn't read everything in the field or enough in the field, which is kind of interesting that they're just from, one manuscript, they were making all those judgments. Incidentally, they were right about all of those things. It was a male student. He was actually a doctoral student, not a master's student. And he was a new scholar. This was actually his first journal submission. So we concluded from some of this research that readers do, especially in this kind of blind peer review setting, build images of authors, and they base those on a collection of elements in the writing. So as a writer, it can be really helpful to understand what are the different things that shape the reader's perception of the writer and how you might be able to somewhat control that author presence in the text. I also want to acknowledge that this isn't all completely controllable, that readers bring a lot to their reading and they don't all make the same judgments about a writer. But there are certain things that you can do as a writer to show yourself as confident or tentative and so on. And that's what we'll look at. Okay, so some of the features, and these are the features that we'll talk about today, are probably not new to a lot of you. I bet you're familiar with some of these. And I'm kind of going to divide them up into categories, although I want to acknowledge that the categories are actually overlap quite a bit. So first we'll talk about stance, or the attitude that an author brings to a text, and we'll look at hedges, boosters, and attitude markers, and I'll explain those terms in a minute. We'll look at credibility. So things like reference to yourself as an author, self-citation, and just citations in general. How we engage with readers, so things like personal asides, appeals to shared knowledge, questions to the readers. And then finally, style, which can include all of the above, but also informal language and humor. We're going to spend the most time on stance, and then I'll kind of introduce you to some of the other elements. That's where we're headed. Okay, so starting with stance. So stance is where we as authors show our commitment to the claims that we're making in our papers, and also sometimes our attitude about other scholarship. So just to look at different ways that authors might demonstrate stance, I have 3 little excerpts from different texts for us to look at. So the first is, our findings suggest that psychology and sociology writers may be especially more likely to adopt a stance to the generalizations they make about the research field. Do you see anything in there that might demonstrate commitment or attitude? So does the author of that first sentence, our findings suggest that, do you have any sense of the author's certainty or attitude, confidence in the claim? Suggest, maybe. Yeah, so those are a little tentative, right? They don't say our findings show that, but rather our findings suggest that. And yeah, maybe especially more likely. Great. Let's look at the second example. These preferences are clearly aligned with the differences in the types of research activities and perspectives that different disciplines prioritize. Do you have any sense of the author's commitment to this claim? Clearly, Svetlana wrote, so right, clearly aligned, not these preferences could be aligned, but they're clearly aligned. It gives us a sense that the author has a real set of kind of feeling of confidence about this. And then the one at the bottom, from an analytical perspective, move analysis has been a productive methodology for examining a variety of academic disciplinary genres. Does anything in here give you a sense of the author's feelings about what they're stating? Productive, right? So we have an like kind of evaluative adjective. We could just say move analysis is a methodology for examining blah, blah, blah. But instead, there's an evaluation. It's a productive methodology. It gives us a sense of how the author feels about the methodology. So just kind of to review those points, we have some caution in the first sentence. We have some confidence in the second sentence, and we have some attitude or evaluation in that third sentence. Okay, so to sort of summarize some of the words that might be helpful. So hedges are these words or phrases that we can use that kind of qualify or dampen some claims so they make it more tentative. Often, perhaps, suggest, could. And boosters claim commitment. So they're bold, right? Actually, certainly, clearly, never, of course. And what we find is that authors use both. So it would be very rare to find only hedges or only boosters, but rather authors tend to mix these. Do you think you, as a writer, tend to use more hedges, or do you think you tend to use more boosters in your research writing? Variety, boosters, personally hedges. I notice that when I give students feedback on their writing, I tend to use many hedges. Sometimes maybe too many hedges because it's a politeness strategy as well. So this is something, if you're not sure, this is something to look at, in your own writing. Do you use more hedges, more boosters? When do you use them? And are you using them purposefully and intentionally to show how strongly you feel about something? Yeah, with hedges, it seems you're uncertain about the finding, or you want to be cautious. Like maybe you believe in the finding, but maybe your study was not huge. And so you don't want to make a really strong claim yet, right? Yeah, so expect, it would be like, we expect to find, so it does show commitment versus like we might find or we could find. Yeah, boosters are tricky. And I think the reason that people tend to not use a lot of boosters is because academic research, especially in the social sciences, is rarely conclusive. Right? From one study, we usually can't sort of say, that's it, we found this, there's no exception. There often are exceptions, or we want to be tentative because this was just one study or one population or one setting. And so hedges help us not overgeneralize our claims or overstate our claims. But it's tricky because we also want to show that the research is important and that there's a contribution. So we can't only use hedges because we might sort of downplay our work too much. Yeah, too many boosters are signs of a stance that might be incompatible with critical thinking. Absolutely, I think that can be true. If you are only boosting, your readers might be skeptical. These are great points. Okay, so we're going to look at a longer text, but I will read it out loud on the screen here. And as I read, what I'd like you to look for are examples of hedges or boosters. So you can underline or highlight or circle, or if you want to just kind of listen and see if you can, in your head, find some, that's fine too. Okay, so this is from a sociology paper. We found several instances of gender differences conditional on the same caregiving status. For grandmothers, we found both positive and negative associations between different arrangements of intergenerational caregiving and different health outcomes. For grandfathers, however, being an intergenerational caregiver was generally associated with lower health risks. Perhaps a fundamental source of gender difference pertains to the form and nature of caregiving activities. For example, in terms of caring for grandchildren, previous research has suggested that Chinese grandfathers tend to play roles such as fun seeker, playmate, and companion, rather than fulfilling more intensive responsibilities such as feeding, bathing, and dressing, which are often assumed by grandmothers. Such gendered caregiving expectations and responsibilities likely have different health implications for grandfathers and grandmothers. I love that some people are putting some of the boosters and hedges in the chat. Great, so found is a booster, right? Generally associated is kind of weakening the claim, or it's a little bit more tentative. Has suggested, tend, those are hedges. Any others that you can see, hedges or boosters? Likely, great. Consistently, good. I don't think I found that one, but that's great. Good job. Which I would call a booster. Okay. So some that we have, found are boosters. There's a lot of hedging though, right? Yet it doesn't, notice that it doesn't sound like a tentative text. It sounds though, like I think someone pointed out earlier, like critical thinking, right? Being careful with interpretations and considering different possibilities, but not overstating the claims. So something is generally associated with lower health risks, perhaps a fundamental source of difference, has suggested, tend to play roles. So it's we don't want to say Chinese grandfathers play roles, but they often play roles, right? Because we want to account for exceptions, often assumed by grandmothers, likely have different health implications. So these are all ways that the author is bringing themselves into the text, showing that they're a critical thinker, showing that they're familiar with this kind of research and that they are considering various possibilities. And when we're writing, academic writing, it's in print and it's going to stay there published forever. So we want to be careful with how we represent the knowledge of our field. There's 3 sentences that are currently overstated, and I want you to hedge them a little bit. And then after that, there are 3 sentences that are too heavily hedged, and I want you to boost them a little bit. So just rewriting them in a way, you might just add a word in or change a verb, but something in the first part to express less certainty, and in the second part to express more certainty, more commitment. So, and it's a little difficult to do this without knowing the real research, right? Because you're not sure how much you can boost or how much you should hedge. So we have to kind of imagine a scenario. But from looking at what you wrote, I think just in terms of your linguistic choices, they're right on. So the trick is then deciding when you can or should use different terms. But I'll just sort of quickly go through these. So like the first one, again, here, maybe as an author, you're not certain about this claim. So a reduced speed limit will result in fewer highway injuries. Your suggestions of just changing this to might result is a good idea. So instead of will, might, may result, could result is even more hedged. Second one study found that Chinese learn English less efficiently than Korean. So notice it's already hedged in a way, in the sense that we say one study found that, right? It's not saying Chinese learn English less efficiently, but rather one study found that. But if we wanted to hedge it even more, we could say one study found that Chinese, as room 2 said, are likely to learn English less efficiently, or tend to learn English less efficiently. Or on average, that's another great one. Learn English less efficiently on average than Koreans. The third one, so instead of the results, establish a link. As room 1 said, you could say suggest a link, or you could say there might be a link between, suggest the existence of a link. So those are great. Moving to the currently very hedged. So we want, let's say these are too hedged. You actually feel pretty good about these findings. You want to state bolder claims. The present authors have attempted to establish, that's pretty weak. So I like these options that you have instead. Have demonstrated a solid medium growth system, a system that replicates instead of that may replicate. We can delete may. Instead of the results suggest, this group said the results cause. So that's a much stronger claim, right? And here we don't know if we can really make that claim. So just imagining that you do feel confident, these would be appropriate phrases to use. Yeah, instead of have attempted to establish, the present authors have established. Make that commitment, right? They did this. The results show an effect instead of suggest a possible effect. It's a very different level of commitment in those two. Yeah, so those are all really nice examples. Number 5, currently we have the present study suggests that these derivatives may have potential uses. That's very heavily hedged, right? So instead of suggest, maybe demonstrate, can be used. That's great. So it's still hedged, but it's not as tentative. It's a stronger commitment. And then we could go even bolder. The present study shows that can be used for instead of may have potential uses for. These are great. And then the last one, we think that the method may open a door for the formation of nanometer aggregates. Ooh, this is very strong. I love this. We have no doubt that. That's a really strong commitment. And, you know, you're not going to write that unless you really have the evidence for it. But if you want to really claim a contribution, that would be good language to use to do so. Oh, I like this. The method opens a new door. Just say it as it is. Instead of may open, just opens a new door. Or even stronger, it will definitely open a new door. Or clearly open a new door. So does that give you a sense of how we can modify language and what the change is as an author, as reading the author, that if you take a bolder stance, it does show confidence. But again, I'm not saying use boosters all the time. You have to think about how confident you are in your research, what you can claim, what's appropriate to claim, and also when you want to be more tentative because you don't want to overclaim. I'll move to the attitude markers, which are another area of stance. And I don't want to spend a long time on this, but I want to just show, and we'll discuss a few options you might have in your own writing for using attitude markers. So this is something that people often think academic writers don't do. And they don't do it a lot, but they do it. We do find attitude markers in published writing. So this is where, as a writer, you're showing maybe surprise, agreement, skepticism, caution, that you find something important or problematic. We use different attitude markers to do that. So this isn't the example we looked at earlier. Perhaps the most striking finding, right? So you're saying something is striking, it's very important. Or this is a very strong attitude marker. It is a sad commentary that, right? As you pointed out earlier, we get a sense of the author's feelings about this and their emotions about this state of the world. So those are examples of attitude markers. One of the most common places that we find these is in literature reviews when authors are describing other research. So if a research study is poorly designed and we're reviewing it in the literature, we might say something like, this limited study, right? That gives us a sense of, all right, it's not a strong study. Can you think of any other adjectives that we could put into that line, that blank line in number 1? If a research study in your field is poorly designed, how could you describe it appropriately in your literature review. Preliminary, for sure. Controversial. Ooh, I like that. So if maybe people have written about that study and some people think it's got flaws, controversial would be a great adjective to use. Yeah, this study has shortcomings. Shortcomings is a nice academic word for limitations. I don't, sometimes small scale is, sometimes it's not negative, but sometimes it is. Results cannot be generalized. Not conclusive, great. Developmental, yeah, or another one that's common is anecdotal. Right, it's not systematic, it's just kind of an example, a personal experience. Inconsistent, nice, these are great. So those are all attitude markers. They show how the author, you as a writer, feels about these other studies. Fragmented, great. What about the next one? Let's say a study was really important in your research area. In my field, seminal is a really common example. This seminal study, yep, and Yevgeny's field too. Outstanding, good. What else could you put in that blank? Everyone says seminal. Yeah, you could say robust, like if it's a really strong research design, or yeah, foundational, excellent. Extensive, significant. Oh, pioneering, yeah, that's a good one. Great. What about number 3? A finding is very important. Ooh, breakthrough is good, Olga. A finding is very important for future research. So we could say this finding is what? Because key, groundbreaking. Great. Cornerstone. Oh, I like that. Notable. Or note, another similar one would be noteworthy. Can perspective be used as an adjective here? This finding is, I don't think it could. False friend. Yeah, I think you're right. I'm trying to think what you could say instead. A game changer. Yeah, that's a good one. Game changer is really, actually, that's kind of nice. It will remind me of that one later because it's also a little bit colloquial. So it also, I kind of like it that if you feel confident enough to bring in some slightly informal language, game changer is a good example of that. Which again, you wouldn't want to use for maybe the whole paper, but perhaps you want it to stand out to readers. So game changer could be a really useful phrase to say that. This study was a game changer in our field. It changed how people understood things. These are great. So you have the idea that these are, oh, perspective. Yeah, this is, yeah, perspective sounds more tentative to me rather than that it's very important. The study is paving the ground for, I have to think about that one. Not sure what a good sort of synonym might be there for perspective. Yeah, we'll come back to that. Great. Okay, so I wanted to show you just kind of how common or rare these are. If you attended the last workshop, you saw lots of tables like this, which showed how different disciplines use language differently in published writing. So this is specifically looking at stance, and you can see stance markers are most common in social sciences. So this is philosophy, sociology, applied linguistics, marketing, And then as we get into the hard sciences and engineering, they're not used as much. So physics, biology, mechanical engineering, and electrical engineering. So these numbers are per 1,000 words, how many stance markers there are. You can see hedges, are more common than boosters, and also more common than attitude markers. So hedges are the most common way that we mark stance in academic writing, but it's notable that attitude markers still appear even in the sciences, the hard sciences, and that boosters are also used. Again, there are some disciplinary differences. The third bullet point, looking at the writing in your field and look at where and when are stance markers used. Where do writers hedge? Where do they tend to boost? Where do you see attitude markers? Is it when they're describing other research? Is it when they're describing the claims from their study? Is it in the methodology? And that's a very helpful tool. And you might also look at which authors do different things, because sometimes we see individual difference. This is why we get that idea of authorial presence. Yeah, so just some key takeaways is that authors can express their commitments to and their attitudes toward knowledge claims through these use of hedges, boosters, and attitude markers, that their preferences can vary by discipline. So it may be rarer to use stance markers in hard sciences, but again, all academics do use them in their published writing. And that's why I recommend looking at different texts in your field and seeing how common or uncommon these are. Let's look at a few more. We're not going to go into as much depth with the others, but I want to make sure you have a lot of tools. So let's move to credibility. And here I just want to introduce this because I think you probably already have a pretty good sense of how authors show credibility in your field. Some of the tools that we see that they use are reference to themselves through first-person pronouns, reference to themselves through citing themselves, and also the way that they cite other people can also be a way to boost credibility. So I don't want to read this one out loud because it's a little bit long, but I'll give you a minute or two to read through this text, which is taken from a published article, and look for where the authors build their credibility in this passage. So again, kind of look for phrases or things that they do that show them to be credible authors. Okay, you can take a minute to read through. The reference is given too late after several summarizings. The link does not show each paper's contribution. The paper is not credible. Oh, that's interesting. They use the literature review and occupations, the niche, occupy the niche to build credibility. That's a good point. They're showing what research is out there and show the gap, and they occupy the gap. That is absolutely a way that we build credibility. I think the point about the references is really interesting too. Any other comments? They say researchers, but half of the researchers are themselves. Exactly. It's very funny, right? It's an odd self-citation and that they use the third person, but then they are citing themselves. They use we, so they show that they have experience in this area, right? We know that they're not new to this kind of research. They use both the third person and first person, which is kind of interesting. Traditionally, that's a really good point. By using something like traditionally, they show that they know what the tradition is. So it's quite subtle, but it is a way to establish credibility, is to show that you understand the field, you understand the history of the field. Yeah. Detailed comparison with prior research and explanation of why and how theirs is different. Exactly. So this engagement, they're showing, if you remember that table I showed at the beginning of what peer reviewers use to make assessments about or to construct a reader, one of them was how they represent the knowledge of the field. So being able to say, this is traditional, this is a gap, that shows that the authors understand the field, that they have experience in the field. Now, of course, they have to be accurate as well, right? But if all of those things align for readers, then that boosts their credibility. I'll show, point out some of the things that I found. So this phrase, the current study follows in a similar manner to these studies. It's showing, I know the trajectory, our study goes within that line of inquiry. Yeah, it's double-edged. I agree with that. Because you also want to show that it's different, but you want to show that you understand the previous research. They use self-mention in several points. Unlike previous studies, we do not. They also, in this unlike previous studies, they also show how they're unique, which could build credibility. Importantly, our study differs from, so again, it's self-mention, but also showing how they're occupying a niche. And then they do have this self-citation. Several of the authors are cited here. So they're doing a lot of different things. And again, there are many ways that authors build credibility. It's not just language, right? The study itself has to be solid. It often has to have something new, whether it's the finding or the methodology, the setting, something about it has to be novel for it to be important. But writers also do use language as ways to build that credibility. And these are some ways that they do that. I want to just quickly ask, what types of things do you think in your field help signal the authority or credibility of an author? Are there any additional features in addition to self-citation, self-mention, showing knowledge of the research background? Yeah, so I want to address the question, how much do they build credibility rather than just establish their place in the literature? So establishing their place in the literature is a part of building credibility. Showing that you know the relevant literature is a part of establishing credibility. And in fact, this is where a reader could also decide someone's not credible if they cite the wrong research, or if they cite old research that has been, corrected or countered. So who you cite is really important as part of establishing your credibility. Which studies you refer to, which studies you don't refer to. One of the first things that I do when I review a manuscript is I look at the references, because then right away I know who the authors are working with, what scholarship they're working with, and what they're not working with. And I already am starting to think, are they familiar with the most recent literature in this area? If they're not citing certain pieces, why not? Maybe there's a good reason for it. But as a reader, I'm using that information to decide how much they know about the field. And I think it's a good point about self-citation being pretty tricky for authors, right? It can look like you just are trying to promote your own work. It's tricky if you have a lot of work in that area, you might need to cite it. Sometimes people cite themselves when they probably should cite somebody else. So that can hurt your credibility, right? It doesn't mean that self-citation is always a credibility builder. It can harm your credibility if you cite yourself, but there's another researcher who's really, really well known for this work and you don't cite them. That could hurt your credibility. Do you think there's any limitations on who can write in this way, who can cite themselves, who can mention themselves, who can sort of claim authority? Like, can a new writer do that? Or do they have to do it differently? Highland. He's a big self-citer. It's interesting. So it's something to think about with all of these aspects that we're looking at today with author presence, that some of what you can do as a writer depends on who you are, right? Are you established in that field? Maybe you have more options for building your credibility than if you're a newcomer. If you are new to the field, maybe you can't cite yourself, but maybe you can show a really strong understanding of the previous research or a really good critical understanding of what's missing. Or you bring a very strong methodology that also builds your credibility, right? So your options for how to build credibility can depend a lot on where you are in the field, how experienced you are, how much research you've done. Maybe you're an experienced researcher, but you're new to this particular topic. So maybe you have to use different strategies for building your credibility. Yeah, if you're new, you can't self-cite, exactly. Okay, I want to move to look at two other features kind of quickly because I want to make sure you have time to practice. So I'm going to go through engagement and style, just sort of showing you some textual features, and then I'm going to give you a text to play around with a little bit. So engagement with readers is a pretty interesting little thing because, again, we tend to think that academic writing doesn't do this. And to be fair, a lot of academic writing doesn't do this. So a lot of academic writing is kind of boring and dry because it doesn't engage with readers. But I really like this quotation from one of my favorite authors, and actually a former teacher of mine, who writes in applied linguistics and has a very notable author presence in his writing. And he wrote a memoir, and he said that one of his colleagues used to say to him, "A good writer is one who makes a friend of his or her reader." And I think that's a really interesting idea because we often do not think about readers in this way of like, the idea here is I want my reader to, have kind of a shared experience with me in this text. And I want to help them enjoy the text. And again, this is discipline specific. It's also maybe who you are. But I will say that this scholar, John Swales, he's done this his entire career. He's very well known now, so it's not surprising that he does this, but he has always done this. So what does this look like? There are a few different ways that writers engage with readers. One is just this simple, it will be up to the reader to determine. It's little things we do to reference the reader. Sometimes we even say the reader. We rarely say you. It will be up to you. But often writers will say it's up to the reader to determine. So this kind of reference. Yeah, I like the comment about making the reader your friend sounds more relevant to maybe books rather than articles, and also seasoned writers. I think that's true to some extent, but I also think there are little things we can do. Directives are another way we engage with readers. So when we tell a reader how to think about something, consider the importance of. Questions engage the reader. These are rhetorical questions, right? We don't really want them to answer it. But how do academic writers use language to express a stance? That's a question, and it prompts this engagement with the reader. Yeah, you instead of the reader is quite rare. We very rarely see it. Appealing to shared knowledge is another way to engage with readers. So a statement like, of course, we know that. The we is not the writers, but we as a community of scholars in this area, we the field. And very rarely, you can see asides are very rare, but they do exist sometimes. Things like, often it is true, insufficiently thought out, right? So this is just a parenthetical kind of the writer's thought. You would use this quite sparingly, if at all. In fact, I would suspect that most writers have never done this in their academic writing. But I want to show it to you just to see the variation that writers have in their writing. Yeah, the pedagogical we. I like that. So you can see again, engagement is variable by discipline. It's quite strong, relatively speaking, in philosophy compared to like biology. And the most common way that we engage with readers are these references, like to the reader. Okay, I'm going to show you just a quick, I want you to do a thumbs up, thumbs down in your Zoom. So I'm going to show you a few sentences, and I want you to give a thumbs up if you think this would be appropriate to use in your own research writing. So in your field, but also by you, like, would you use this? Do you feel comfortable using it? Do you think it would be appropriate? And a thumbs down if you think it would not be. Okay, so the first one, it will be up to the reader to determine the relevance of these findings in the real world. So give a thumbs up if you think, yeah, I could use that appropriately, or a thumbs down if you think, no, this wouldn't work in the way I write and in my field and in my journals. Okay, so we have a mix. I guess we have mostly negatives. Does anyone think, yes, you could use it? No? Okay. How about this one? We still know little about how students use ghostwriting services. Could you use that? We have more thumbs up on that one. So that's that royal we, or I like the pedagogical we, right? We as a field. That's a way to show solidarity, engage your readers, and it's a really easy way to do it. How about the next one? It is important to note that these findings may not be generalizable. That's a directive. Could you use that? Get more thumbs up on that one. Notice that that's also an attitude marker, right? You're saying what is important. Great. What do these two processes have in common? Question. Could you use that in your writing? A question like that? We have some thumbs up. This measurement is distinctly different from the more familiar gradient measurement. The more familiar shows shared knowledge. It's like acknowledging we all think this is familiar. Okay, so that looks like a possible strategy. And then this personal aside, and as I believe many writing teachers will acknowledge, confidence can be a key barrier to writing development. So do you feel like you would use that kind of strategy? Personal aside. Yeah, so some maybe uncertainty about this one. This is the one that was really rare, I think you might remember. And it also, I want to point out, really can depend on what you're writing, right? So maybe in a research article, you wouldn't do this, but in maybe a response to an article, you might do this, right? So it could depend on the genre. the activity in which you're writing. Okay, so I hope those give you some ideas about engagement. I want to just very briefly show style elements just for fun, because these are super rare, but I always like to show people that authors do play with academic writing. It's not always just boring. So I'm just going to show you the examples. Here are some ways that authors often use informal elements in their writing. So first person pronouns are considered informal. These direct questions are considered informal. Contractions, don't, can't, won't. These are considered informal, and so they're generally discouraged in academic writing. And we don't see them very often. They're very, very rare. But because they're rare, if you use them, they're notable. And that can be bad. But in certain cases, writers are able to do this effectively. So again, I'm not saying, go use all of these. Don't. But consider if there are times where a little bit of informality might actually do something positive to your writing. You want to be very careful, but sometimes it's appropriate. Split infinitives are considered informal. So when you put something in between the to and the verb, that's an informal element. That's actually pretty common. It's getting more common in English academic writing. Exclamation points, very rare, but I have seen them occasionally in my field. Again, very rare and depends on the genre. And then sentence initial conjunctions, like beginning a sentence with and, is more like spoken English, but occasionally you actually see this in academic writing. So these are ways that if you want to kind of vary your writing style a little bit, you can, again, very sparingly, you could consider using some of these forms of writing. I want to show you some really funny things too. Occasionally, writers use humor. This is not advised for research articles in general, but there may be other types of academic writing where you can bring some humor in. This is a student textbook, and I find this really funny. This is chapter 1 of a statistics textbook, and they have a footnote at the chapter title where they say this chapter might have been called Introduction, but nobody reads the introduction, and we wanted you to read this. We feel safe admitting this here in the footnote because nobody reads footnotes either. So this is, again, a textbook. It's a different type of academic writing, but notice how the authors are trying to have fun with the writing, and they're sort of playful with the readers. I think it's really cute. This also sometimes happens in acknowledgements. So if you read the acknowledgements, which is, again, a low stakes part of academic writing, you might find some funny things. These people are thanking the National Science Foundation, which is a grant funder, for regularly rejecting my honest grant applications for work on real organisms, thus forcing me into theoretical work. It's very cute, right? I love the fire. Another example, the order of authorship was determined from a 25-game croquet series held at Imperial College Field Station. And then another one, we acknowledge Snowpocalypse 2010 for making the long-awaited completion of this paper possible. So authors are having fun. Another just really quick example I wanted to show you. I don't know if these look familiar to you, but these are all references to Bob Dylan songs that came from writers in microbiology, I think it is. Nitric acid and inflammation, the answer is blowing in the wind. Don't think twice, it's all right. Knocking on pollen's door. And in fact, there's so many that someone actually analyzed how many people in biomedical literature cite Bob Dylan. It's like this very common thing that biomedical researchers are doing. So I know those are far afield, but I think they're fun as examples of how scholars are having a good time with academic writing. I want, though, to give you a chance to apply this. I've given you a rather boring passage, and I want to see if you can use some of the strategies. You will see a text in a box, and I want you to just edit it and see if you can make it a little more interesting. Maybe you want to boost your claims. Maybe you want to engage your readers. Maybe you want to boost your credibility. I want you to imagine, though, that you are a prominent researcher in the area, okay? So this is kind of a role play. You have years of experience and you have many publications. You want to engage your readers. You want to bring them along with your argument, and you do not want to give the impression of a neutral scientist. So this is your goal as a writer. You also do want to be appropriate. So I don't want you to go crazy, but I want you to think about how you can apply some of what we've talked about to kind of bring some author presence into this text. I think all of you started with a question, which is exactly what the actual author did. So he writes, what then are some of the implications of a sociocognitive view of SLA? Here, I will speculate because, as I have already pointed out, no such coherent view yet exists. In the interim, I will take my cues largely from pedagogically oriented L1 research, blah, blah, blah. Notice that he gives these examples and then he does a CF self-reference. And the CF is like in contrast to. So he's setting himself apart from other references. And then he says, I should also note that, blah, 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 have not yet in most cases been closely linked to SLA theory. So he's got some hedges. He's got a lot of I, lots of use of personal pronouns. This is a research article, by the way, in a research journal. It's a more theoretical article, but and it is quite well cited. And then going on to the second paragraph, one implication of a sociocognitive approach is that teaching is valuable and that learning and teaching go hand in hand. I highlighted that because it's kind of colloquial. It's a more spoken expression of English. And then he's got the but at the beginning of the sentence. Instead of however, in contrast, uses the more informal, but teaching in this view is also often hedge incidental. And then moving to the end here, if as second language teachers we can harness, so notice how he's positioning the readers, assuming that they are second language teachers, which many may be, but many might not be. It's an applied linguistics journal, so most have a commitment to second language teaching, but it's a very interesting move. And then the use of actually, which is a booster, and lots of uses of we throughout. So I think it's an interesting example of maybe more extreme, but this is, again, an original text, and it's someone using a lot of the markers that we looked at as a way to insert himself into the text. I just want to close with a little bit of review. Hopefully you can think through how you might use these in your writing. Again, some of them may be sparing, some you might never use, but you might find places where you can insert your opinions, your credibility, your commitments throughout your writing. I hope it gives you some ideas to bring what I feel is maybe some more confidence into your writing.